Hey there Facebook, it is Vanessa here again, your speaker, trainer and coach from Live, Love, Give, and today I am off to Warrnambool. So I'm sitting in the car, my beautiful mum is about to take off and drive, and today's message is really all about the fact that your triggers do not cause trauma, and in actual fact they cause your greatest triumphs if you have this kind of mindset that you need behind them. So I'm going to dive into exactly what on earth I'm talking to about when I say that, and I want us to develop the kind of relationship with our with our triggers that can create greatest triumphs in our life. And the reason why I'm bringing this message to you guys today is because I was having this conversation with one of my incredible friends this morning. I was on the phone and he asked me, what are triggers, and what are my triggers? And I've been working a lot, as you guys know, with Dr. Demartini's work over the last week. And there's been a lot about that in terms of identifying what these triggers are and going through what's called the Demartini method. And ultimately, through this method and through this process, we identify what the triggers are and we use them to our advantage. And that's why, this friend of mine was saying, I've really been noticing that I've been getting triggered a lot, and things have been kind of making me want to say, F off, I'm going elsewhere. So what they'd been kind of doing over the last week or so had been avoiding, running away from the trigger and just kind of, just trying to avoid the trigger. And, that is part of the problem and the suffering that we all create for ourselves when we think that anything that doesn't feel good, we think that anything that kind of triggers us and makes us feel uncomfortable is bad. And we try and do whatever we can to avoid and run away from whatever that triggering circumstance or situation is. And the problem with that is that we keep ourselves stuck in a fantasy as to how things should be. Our blueprint of how things should be becomes all positive, all supportive, always feeling good. And we get into this constant positivity kind of mindset, which ultimately sets us up for failure. And because we can't have just all support and positivity in our lives. And when we think that anything bad and anything that triggers us, we need to get away from and we need to avoid, and it shouldn't be there, then ultimately we create all of this kind of suffering, this back and forth, this torment within ourselves. We create our own traumas within when we don't understand the value that every single one of our triggers is trying to point out for us. And this is what, you guys know that I've shared with you part of the process I went through this past week. So the breakthrough experience in particular with Dr. John Demartini. What you had to do for an entire day, we worked on one individual in our lives and we identified the top 3 traits, actions or inactions that we see within this person doing that totally trigger us and that we have a lot of resentment around. We have a lot of negativity. We want to avoid this person. They trigger us, and we identify exactly what those key triggers are. And ultimately we go on a process of being able to own fully what those traits are within us, because there are over 4,000, or Dr. John Demartini has identified that we have at least 4,027 different traits within every single one of us. We all have access to every single one of these particular human traits. And until what we see in another that triggers us, that gets us this emotional charge, is ultimately this trigger is identifying and for us the traits within ourselves that we have yet to own, and where we are expecting ourselves and other human beings to be one-sided, when at the end of the day we can't move forward fully into inspiration, love, and gratitude until we recognize that we are all things, and that we get to a place of owning and loving the whole spectrum of who we are and who another human being is. And the way that we do that is we use our triggers to identify those parts within us that we haven't actually owned yet. And we go on a process. It's a very in-depth process, the DeMartini method. It's pretty full on. It literally took us an entire day's work to just work through one individual, but because we selected the individual who we most are resentful towards, who we are most triggered by, then ultimately it knocks out a lot more of the work with other individuals that we will work with in our lives. But these triggers, why I really want you guys to get in your mind that anything that triggers you is guiding you towards your ultimate and greatest triumph in your life, if you take on the mentality of owning the universal law, the quantum physics, that everything has an opposing opposite. Everything has a complementary opposite. There's not just one side of anything. Every negative has a positive, every positive has a negative. Everything is like a magnet. And, to get caught up in the fantasy that you can have one-sidedness and you can just have this all positive life with no negative and no challenge and all support and all comfort, is absolutely creating your own traumas and absolutely imprisoning you in a life filled with suffering, where you can maybe feel good half of the time, but you're missing all the beauty, the meaning, and reality as it actually is. And so I'm hoping that me sharing this and talking into this for you guys is allowing you to see where in your life you are currently being kind of triggered by other individuals in your life, and ultimately with those triggers, owning them in yourself, recognizing that every trigger that you have is pointing you towards some trait, some part of yourself that you have yet to own and love within yourself, and you're not grateful for it. And so it's creating a lot of trauma in your life. And so I'm definitely hoping that this is resonating with you guys. It's going to get you thinking in terms of anything that triggers you is ultimately leading you to your greatest triumphs. And how that's really played out in my life, I'll just give you a quick example, because I went through this process, obviously, the DeMartini method. And I, as you guys who've been following me over the last week at least, know that I did the work on my granny, who I was resenting a couple of different traits within that I felt was preventing me from having the kind of depth and connection that I would ultimately want in that relationship. And so I identified the top 3 traits that were in her that I was really resenting, and I owned them all throughout the day. I went through 14 different questions of actually owning every single one of those traits within myself to the same degree. And I'll give you a little bit of an example from the top of my head of what I can remember. But the number one thing that I was finding within her that I was judging her to be closed-minded. And I just thought of myself as this very open-minded individual, and I thought of her as this closed-minded person. But what I've come to discover through this process, and actually going back to different moments, hundreds of different moments in my life, where I was able to reflect back and see myself as definitely closed-minded in those moments, what I was able to learn and uncover is that whenever anybody is operating in the realm of our values, we're very open-minded. We see everything that they say and do, if it's in alignment with our values, what we find most meaningful, we're incredibly open-minded individuals. And the opposite is true when somebody is operating outside of what we value most. We become very close-minded. And so my granny and I have differing values, and therefore, when I was talking about what I value most, she became closed-minded, and because she wasn't operating in my values, I became simultaneously closed-minded towards her and judgmental towards her. So when we get to the point of owning fully, to the same degree, all of these different traits that we're triggered by emotionally within other individuals, when we get to that place, we actually get to a place where we have synchronized and synthesized the opposing different traits that we've been triggered by, because I was able to go back and reflect and find all these different other times that my granny was completely open-minded and operating in the opposing trait that I was finding myself so triggered by. So anytime you are triggered, you are only seeing all negatives. You're only seeing one side of the equation and you are discounting reality. And so if you want to be an individual who wants to triumph rather than whoops, lost you guys for a second, and my battery might go flat, so I hope I don't lose all you guys soon. But ultimately what I was saying is that those traumas, the triggers can lead us to our greatest triumphs in our life if we use them to recognize and be feedback that we're living in a one-sided, lopsided perception that is creating all of the trauma and drama in our lives. And the moment we get to the point where we do the work to find the balance that is absolutely at play, it's a universal law, then when sorry, somebody was trying to call me on Messenger. I thought I had my notifications off. When we can get to that place of synthesizing to that middle ground and find the equal and opposing definite in sync, how everything is in balance, we can see the positive to the negative, and vice versa. That is when we can triumph, and we can definitely use our triggers to identify where we are being lopsided. They're just feedback, and they're not to be avoided. They're absolutely to be followed and to be owned within us. So I'm really hoping that this is valuable to you guys. I definitely want to check in with you guys and see who's been able to join me. And it feels very distracting because we're on the way to beautiful Warrnambool. So I've got my mum driving, and I want to check in with you guys. I've got Stephen and MD and Thai and Alexandria and Moyne. And Dennis is here, and Hyungal, and Krish, and Elliot, and Lucy's here. And hello to you, Elliot, and Stephanie, and Ranbir, and Jeremy's here, and Jens, and Gary, and Tom, and Wayan, and Peter, and Jason, and Matt, and Jeremy, and Zahia, and Anantha. Can you quickly brief the topic, please? Sorry when you wrote that. I'm not sure when that was, Anantha. I hope that you've picked up and identified that what I was really talking to you guys about today is not avoiding our triggers, but actually owning that every time we are triggered, it's simply feedback to make us aware that we have a lopsided perception, and we're simply focusing on the negatives, the drawbacks, the disadvantages, as opposed to recognizing the balance that is always at play. There is always a positive, there's always a payoff, there's always an advantage. And instead of avoiding what triggers us, we ultimately need to find the other side so that we can access our greatest triumphs by being in balance. So hope that is valuable to you guys. And Anantha, hope that answered your question. And Maria's here, and Chris, and Nathan, and Ella Varison, and Kylie, and Melissa. And Anantha, should the triggers make you a positive push, or even if they make you feel negative or feel down and create a feeling of not being able to achieve something, is it also fine? Can you explain? Okay, yes. So should the triggers make you a positive push, or even no? So what happens is, so the DeMartini method, and ultimately what I'm explaining to you today, the DeMartini method is very in-depth, so I'm not going to articulate the entire DeMartini method to you right now, but I'm going to give you the shortened version, which is the purpose of the DeMartini method. And what I'm talking to you guys about right now is in terms of balancing out your perception. is to get you ultimately to a place of love and gratitude. So if you think about a horizontal kind of, a line, and on one side you've got positive, and on the other side you've got negative. Central, right in the middle, when the positive and the negative meet, is a state of love and gratitude and ultimately inspiration. So when we see both sides simultaneously, that synchronicity is love and gratitude and inspiration. And all of the emotions on that spectrum between the positive and the negative are simply just one-sided. They're emotional states of being that are only seeing all positive or all negative. And until we can get to seeing both sides simultaneously, that's when we get to love. And all else creates infatuation on the positive and resentment on the negative, which create our pain and suffering. And so the triggers are an alert, they're a feedback mechanism, just like any other emotion from positive to negative is a feedback mechanism to show you what your perception is telling you. And if you want to get to a state of love and gratitude, that peace, that certainty within, then ultimately we need to always find the other side to balance ourselves out. And that is ultimately what the DeMartini method is all about, getting you to a state of love and gratitude, being able to find meaning and balance in all of the emotional spectrum, and using our triggers to alert us to this time and place where we are just having this lopsided perception, we're creating our own suffering, and to balance ourselves out so that we can be in a state of love and gratitude. I really hope that how I'm explaining that is resonating and making sense with you guys out there, and I hope that answered your question, Anantha. I always appreciate your questions and you being here. And Andrew and Michael and Lisa and Jacinta and Steve's here, and Rachel, love to you, and David and Scott and Chris and Johnny. I'm loving that this is really good for you. That's awesome to hear. And Mo Bean, you are a knowledge factory. I like that one. I'll take that one. Thanks. And Hassani's here, and thank you, Mo Bean, for your compliment there. And James and Savula and Murdad and Dennis, turn off self-doubt, let it happen or make it happen. We already know the answer. Need to encourage or kick ourselves in the ass and stop the second guessing. It's what I'm doing so far, so good. Awesome, Dennis. I love it. And what I'm finding is that the more we can bring ourselves back into balance and not have these lopsided perceptions of all good or all bad, we get into that state of love and gratitude and inspiration. And when we tap into that, we access our greatness. We access our highest values to us as an individual. We get into our creative zone where we can come up with creative ideas and ultimately evolve and expand our consciousness and access the executive part of the brain that gets us moving in our most empowered direction. It is what allows us to tap into our genius, our greatest gift that we have to give to the world, and ultimately experience fulfillment. But when we stay stuck in the positive, oh my God, sorry, I think I stubbed my toe earlier and I just moved it. I think I might have fractured it or something. God, that was so painful. Sorry, let me get back to it. So when we have that lopsided perception of just all positive, all negative, it gets in our way of accessing our inspiration, our greatness, and we get stuck in trauma instead of triumph. And so I love you sharing your experience here, Dennis, and loving that this is resonating with you. And Gabrielle's here, and Jack's here. Awesome. And loving that you're agreeing with what I'm sharing today, Mo Bean. And Scott, awesome to have you here. This is awesome. I feel like I'm logging in to get the cheat notes from the weekend and not having to do my homework. You could have made a real difference to me at uni. I love it. Fantastic summation and great to listen to, knocking it out of the park. I love that, Scott. And thank you, Scott. I'm going to, publicly thank you for the weekend. I met you at Dr. John Demartini's breakthrough experience in Sydney, and you selected me as your surrogate. I've let a lot of people know about that, and me helping you break through in your way helped me break through with my ex-partner as well. So I'm super grateful for you, and I love that how I've explained this is resonating with you, and definitely good cheat notes. I like that. I like I've provided that. Thanks, Scott. And Mobeen, I'm loving that this is so true for you. And Tony's here. And Gabrielle, love, gratitude, inspiration, empowerment, and meaning. Boom. Some of my absolute favorite states of being, and definitely what I think we should all be trying to aspire to stay more in. And we're all human beings, so we're going to have our lopsided perceptions, the negative, the positive. It's going to happen, but if we have the tools and the knowledge of knowing that we're in a fantasy when we only see one side, and that we can end our suffering by ultimately bringing things back into balance with a great system and tool of, one tool is the Demartini method, but finding the opposing value to what you perceive as being of no value is absolutely going to get you into that place of centeredness, love, gratitude, inspiration, get you empowered, and get you out of that pain and suffering.